For more than 3,000 years, the most famous face on Earth has been staring back at us without blinking. Printed on textbooks, museum banners, documentaries, souvenirs, and posters, it became the symbol of ancient Egypt itself. A young king, perfectly preserved, untouched by time. Or at least, that's what we were told. Because beneath 22 pounds of solid gold, something was hidden that no one was supposed to find. Not a crack, not a repair, not a mistake, a lie, and not a small one either. A deliberate decision made in desperation, carried out by master craftsmen who knew exactly how to erase history without leaving fingerprints. A deception so precise it fooled archaeologists, curators, and historians for an entire century. Not because they were careless, but because the truth was buried at a level no one knew how to read. What finally exposed it wasn't a chisel or a tomb robbery. It wasn't a lost papyrus or a newly translated inscription. It was physics, quantum physics, a technology designed to read what metal remembers, even when its surface looks flawless. When scientists aimed that technology at King Tutankhamun's death mask, they weren't looking for scandal. They weren't trying to rewrite history. They were running what was supposed to be a routine scan. But what appeared on their screens didn't belong in any textbook. Hidden beneath the hieroglyphs, beneath the polished gold, beneath the face the world thought it knew, there was another name. A name that didn't belong to a boy king. A name that belonged to someone far more powerful and far more dangerous to remember. Because if the data is right, then Egypt's most iconic artifact was never meant for King Tut at all. It was taken, altered, rebranded, and used to bury a secret so explosive it stayed sealed for 3,300 years. And once you see how it was done, you can't unsee it. But to understand how the world fell for it, you have to go back to the moment the mask first emerged from the darkness, and why, from the very beginning, something about it didn't make sense. When Howard Carter peered through that small hole in the Valley of the Kings in November 1922, he wasn't just uncovering a tomb. He was opening a portal into legend. Golden objects piled upon each other, untouched since the Bronze Age. Chariots, thrones, statues frozen mid-movement, as if the people who placed them there had only just stepped away. But none of it mattered the moment the mask was revealed. The gold face became instant myth. Not because it was beautiful, although it was, but because it felt alive. The eyes, made from obsidian and quartz, reflected light in a way that made them seem aware. The symmetry was unsettling. The craftsmanship was beyond anything most people associated with the ancient world. This wasn't art. This was technology. To the ancient Egyptians, gold wasn't just valuable. It was divine. They believed it was the literal flesh of the gods. And a royal burial mask wasn't meant to impress the living. It had one critical function: to help the soul recognize its body in the afterlife. Without it, the spirit could wander forever, unable to return, unable to become eternal. That made the mask sacred in a way few objects ever were. It wasn't optional. It wasn't symbolic. It was essential. On the back of the mask, a spell from the Book of the Dead was carved directly into the gold. Words meant to protect the king as he passed into darkness. Words meant to shield him from chaos itself. And for decades, scholars described the mask using one word over and over again: flawless. Perfect. Untouched. Original. The assumption was simple. Tutankhamun died young. His mask was made for him. End of story. Except history rarely works that cleanly. Almost immediately after its discovery, quiet doubts began circulating among experts. Not accusations. Not headlines. Just questions that didn't have comfortable answers. Questions that were easy to dismiss, because accepting them would mean something was deeply wrong. The first issue was time. King Tut didn't die after a long illness. He died suddenly. And Egyptian law was absolute. A pharaoh had exactly 70 days to be mummified, prepared, and buried. Not 71. Not 69. Exactly 70. That clock started the moment Tut died. 70 days to carve a tomb out of limestone. 70 days to construct multiple nested coffins. 70 days to prepare thousands of grave goods. And 70 days to create one of the most complex gold artifacts ever made by human hands. A mask weighing more than a bowling ball. Inlaid with semi-precious stones. Inscribed with microscopic hieroglyphs. Polished to a mirror finish. From scratch. Somehow, the mask was treated as the one thing no one questioned. As if it had appeared fully formed, immune to the logistical nightmare surrounding everything else in the tomb. But when researchers began examining the rest of the burial, cracks appeared in the story. The tomb itself was unusually small for a king, almost cramped. Some of the wall paintings looked unfinished, as if the artists were rushed out mid-stroke. The massive stone sarcophagus was chipped at the corners, suggesting it barely fit through the doorway. And many of the treasures didn't match Tut at all. Statues bore facial features that didn't resemble him. Jewelry was sized for a different body. Names had been scraped away and hastily recarved. Evidence of reuse was everywhere, except, supposedly, on the mask, which raised an uncomfortable possibility. What if the mask wasn't the exception? What if it was the most carefully altered object of all? At first glance, nothing seemed wrong. But the longer scholars stared at it, the stranger it felt. Details that should have been impossible. Design choices that violated strict religious rules. Features that didn't belong on an adult male pharaoh. Things that were easy to ignore, until you couldn't. And once those details were noticed, the mask stopped looking like a masterpiece. It started looking like evidence. And that evidence pointed toward someone history tried very hard to erase. Ancient Egypt didn't leave much room for improvisation when a king died. Ritual wasn't tradition, it was law. And when that law was broken, the consequences weren't political. They were cosmic. From the moment a pharaoh took his last breath, a sacred clock began ticking. 70 days. That was it. No extensions. No exceptions. The soul's journey to the afterlife depended on every step being completed within that window. Miss it, and the king risked eternal disorientation, unable to reunite with his body, unable to rule in the next world. That meant the entire burial process had to move with brutal precision. The body needed to be mummified, organs removed and preserved, the tomb prepared, coffins constructed, protective spells carved, grave goods assembled, and most importantly, a royal burial mask had to be ready. Now imagine the problem King Tut's death created. He wasn't expected to die. Not at 19. Not suddenly. There was no long illness. No warning. No time to quietly prepare burial equipment in advance. And yet, the mask discovered in his tomb wasn't just adequate, it was extraordinary. One of the most complex gold artifacts ever produced by ancient civilization. That alone should have raised alarms. A royal burial mask wasn't something you rushed. It required highly skilled goldsmiths, stone inlay specialists, scribes to carve sacred texts, and weeks of polishing and refinement. This wasn't woodworking. Gold work at that level demanded absolute control. One mistake could ruin the entire piece. And they supposedly did all of it while scrambling to complete everything else, in 70 days, after a completely unexpected death. The math didn't work. When Egyptologists examined Tut's tomb more closely, they found signs of panic everywhere. The tomb itself was far smaller than expected for a king, suggesting it wasn't originally meant for him at all. Wall paintings showed uneven quality, as if different teams were racing against the clock. Some figures lacked detail. Others looked unfinished. Even the stone sarcophagus told a story of desperation. Its corners were chipped, not from age, but from force. Researchers believe workers literally had to smash parts of it off just to squeeze it through the narrow entrance. That's not how royal burials were planned. That's how they were salvaged. And then came the artifacts. Statues originally crafted for other royals had been modified to resemble Tut. Faces reshaped. Names erased. Titles recarved. Jewelry designed for different proportions. Coffins that showed signs of earlier inscriptions scraped away and replaced. Recycling wasn't subtle. It was obvious. Except, somehow, the mask remained untouchable. That contradiction bothered researchers for decades. Why would everything else show signs of reuse? Except the most time-consuming object of all. Why would craftsmen rush the tomb, rush the coffins, rush the paintings, but calmly take the time to create a flawless, perfectly customized burial mask from scratch? Some scholars argued that the mask must have already existed, that it was prepared earlier, perhaps long before Tut's death. But that theory created a new problem. Why would a young king who had barely ruled long enough to establish himself have a fully completed, ultra-refined burial mask waiting in advance? Other pharaohs didn't even receive that privilege. Others suggested that Tut's successors spared no expense and forced the work to be completed regardless of cost. But that explanation ignored the evidence of haste everywhere else. If time and resources were unlimited, the tomb wouldn't look the way it did. Then there was the religious angle, and this is where the theory really started to crack. Egyptian belief demanded perfection in burial objects. You couldn't simply make do. A mask designed for one person couldn't be casually reused for another, unless the alternative was worse. Unless the deadline mattered more than tradition. That raised a dangerous possibility. What if, when Tut died, there was no mask ready for him at all? What if the priests had no choice? What if they grabbed something that already existed, something sacred, something royal, and altered it just enough to pass? That would explain everything. The rushed tomb, the reused artifacts, the desperation. And suddenly, the mask didn't look miraculous anymore. It looked suspicious. Because if it wasn't made during those 70 days, then it must have been made before. And if it was made before, it was made for someone else. And that realization forced scholars to look at the mask itself not as a masterpiece, but as a crime scene. Because once you stop assuming it's original, small details become impossible to ignore. Details that quietly violate everything Egypt believed about kingship. Details that point to a different owner entirely. At first glance, King Tut's mask looks untouchable. Symmetrical, calm, divine. The kind of object that discourages questions simply by existing. But the moment scholars stopped admiring it and started studying it, the illusion began to fracture. The clues weren't hidden. That's the unsettling part. They were always there, sitting in museum lighting, photographed millions of times, reproduced endlessly in books and documentaries. The problem wasn't access. The problem was assumption. Everyone assumed the mask was Tut's, so no one asked what it was actually saying. The first red flag sat right on the sides of the face. The ears. They were pierced. In ancient Egypt, that wasn't a fashion choice. It was a rule-bound signal. Pierced ears were associated with children and women. Adult male pharaohs were never depicted that way in sacred burial objects. Not ever. A king's afterlife image had to reflect eternal authority and perfection. Earrings didn't fit that image. Yet here they were. Two clearly defined piercings, carved into solid gold. Not decorative. Not symbolic. Functional. Some tried to explain it away. Maybe Tut was young. Maybe conventions were flexible. Maybe it didn't matter. But Egyptologists knew better. Religious iconography wasn't flexible, especially when it came to royal burials. Every detail followed cosmic law. Deviations weren't artistic flair. They were errors, and errors weren't allowed. Then came the face itself. The longer experts examined it, the harder it became to describe as masculine. The jawline was soft, the cheeks fuller, the lips subtly shaped in a way that didn't match other male pharaoh depictions from the same period. This wasn't about modern gender interpretation. It was about ancient standards. Other royal masks and statues gave clear templates for how kings were portrayed. Tut's mask didn't fit neatly into them. Even the gold told a strange story. Under certain lighting, researchers noticed a subtle color difference between the face and the headdress. Not dramatic, not obvious, but unmistakable once seen. The face carried a slightly warmer, reddish tone. The Neem's headdress above it reflected a cooler shade of gold. If the mask had been cast and finished as a single piece, that shouldn't happen. Gold from the same batch, worked at the same time, should age uniformly. Color variation suggested different thermal histories, different moments of heating, hammering, and refinement. That was deeply unsettling. Then there were the ears again. Researchers measured them carefully and noticed something even stranger. The lobes weren't symmetrical. One was slightly thicker. The piercing angles differed. That's not how precision royal objects were made, unless they had been altered. Once that idea entered the conversation, everything shifted. What if the ears had originally been pierced for earrings, and later modified? What if they were plugged? What if the craftsmen used identical gold alloy to fill the holes, hammering and polishing until the seams disappeared? To the naked eye, the ears looked solid. But to anyone familiar with ancient metalworking, the shapes hinted at intervention. And if the ears had been altered, what else had been touched? That question led scholars back to the most dangerous possibility of all. The mask didn't just look feminine. It might have been made for a woman. And not just any woman. Because there was only one figure powerful enough, close enough, and mysteriously absent enough to make the theory work. A woman whose image was already famous. A woman whose disappearance left a hole in history no one could explain. Her name had been whispered for decades in academic circles, usually followed by uncomfortable silence. Because if the mask truly belonged to her, then it meant one of the greatest archaeological finds in history was built on a substitution. a royal identity swap. And that name was Nefertiti. She wasn't just a queen. She was the wife of Akhenaten, the pharaoh who nearly broke Egyptian religion by promoting a single god. After his death, Nefertiti didn't fade into obscurity. She may have taken power herself, ruling as pharaoh under a different name. Then, suddenly she vanished. No confirmed tomb. No confirmed mummy. No burial equipment. She was erased with surgical precision. If she died before Tut, and if her burial mask had already been prepared, the timeline suddenly made terrifying sense. The pierced ears, the refined facial structure, the rushed alterations, the reused artifacts. It all aligned. But alignment isn't proof. And that was the problem. No one could test the theory without damaging the mask, something that was unthinkable. So the idea stayed trapped in academic limbo. Discussed quietly. Dismissed publicly. A theory everyone knew about, but no one could touch. Until something went wrong. Something so careless, so human, that it cracked open a mystery sealed for 3 millennia. For decades, King Tut's mask was treated less like an artifact and more like a relic. It was untouchable, literally and symbolically. Access was tightly controlled. Scanning it required layers of approval. Any proposal that hinted at invasive testing was shut down immediately. That protection was the reason the Nefertiti theory stayed theoretical. There was no legal, ethical way to examine the mask deeply enough to confirm or deny it. And so the mystery slept. Until 2014. The incident didn't happen during a bold experiment or a controversial study. It happened during routine cleaning at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. No cameras rolling. No announcement. Just a worker doing what had been done countless times before. And then the worst possible thing happened. The ceremonial beard, the braided symbol of divine kingship, snapped clean off. For a moment, history froze. The beard wasn't decorative. It was sacred, a representation of godhood itself. And now it lay broken, separated from the face it had survived beside for over 3,000 years. What happened next turned a mistake into a scandal. Instead of contacting expert conservators trained in ancient materials, museum staff panicked. They feared backlash, headlines, repercussions, so they did the unthinkable. They reached for modern industrial adhesive, epoxy, the kind used for plumbing and car repairs. They applied it quickly, sloppily, pressed the beard back into place, and hoped no one would notice. Everyone noticed. Visitors saw hardened glue smeared along the chin. Photos surfaced online. Conservation experts around the world reacted with disbelief. Egypt's most famous treasure, preserved across centuries of war and decay, had been damaged by haste and fear. International outrage followed. To contain the damage, Egyptian authorities brought in an international conservation team led by German specialist Christian Ekman. His official mission was simple: remove the epoxy and reattach the beard using traditional materials, the way ancient craftsmen would have done it. But Ekman understood something critical. Before anything was fixed, the mask had to be examined. Thoroughly. For the first time in modern history, the mask was removed from display and placed under advanced imaging equipment. Not to uncover secrets, but to ensure the repair wouldn't cause further harm. That moment changed everything. Ekman's team used X-ray fluorescence scanning, a non-invasive method capable of identifying metal composition and internal structures. If the mask had been assembled from different parts, if a face had been soldered on, the scans would reveal it. For months, researchers analyzed every millimeter. The results seemed definitive. The gold composition appeared consistent. The hieroglyphs spelling Tutankhamun's name showed no obvious erasure. The glass inlays around the eyes were intact, meaning no high-heat soldering had occurred on the surface. To many, that was the end of the story. The official conclusion stated that the mask was original, that the theories of reuse were unfounded, that the pierced ears were stylistic anomalies, that the color differences were optical illusions. Case closed. The beard was reattached using beeswax. The mask returned to display. The textbooks stayed the same, but not everyone was convinced. A small group of scientists and materials experts noticed something troubling about the scans. Not what they showed, but what they couldn't show. X-rays were excellent at revealing cracks, seams, and density differences. But they couldn't tell how gold had been worked over time. They couldn't read history written at the atomic level. Ancient Egyptian craftsmen weren't amateurs. They were masters of metal. If they wanted to hide alterations, they knew how. Using gold from the same batch. heating and hammering with extreme precision, smoothing surfaces until seams disappeared completely. X-rays would see nothing. That realization reopened the case. Because if the modifications were done with enough skill, then the mask could still be altered, just in a way modern tools weren't designed to detect. To see that kind of deception, scientists would need a different approach. A technology that didn't just look through metal, but could read the story of how it had been shaped. At the time, such technology barely existed outside experimental labs. But by the mid-2020s, that was about to change. And when it did, someone decided to aim it at the most famous artifact in human history. When the official reports declared King Tut's mask authentic and untouched, most of the world accepted it without hesitation. After all, the scans had spoken. The gold composition matched. The inscriptions looked clean. The seams everyone expected to find simply weren't there. To the public, that sounded final. But to materials scientists, it sounded incomplete. Because X-rays, for all their power, are blunt instruments. They reveal structure, density, voids, cracks. What they don't reveal is process. They can tell you what something looks like now, not how it was made, altered, or repaired centuries ago. That distinction mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. Gold is a strange material. Unlike stone or wood, it doesn't forget easily. Every time it's heated, hammered, stretched, or compressed, its internal atomic structure changes. Those changes don't always show up as visible seams or density shifts, but they remain locked inside the metal like a memory. Ancient Egyptian goldsmiths understood this instinctively. They didn't need modern physics to know how far gold could be pushed without betraying itself. Their techniques were advanced enough to create joints invisible even under magnification. And if they were racing a sacred deadline, hiding alterations wasn't optional, it was essential. This was the blind spot. The earlier scans were looking for obvious tampering, solder lines, chemical mismatches, surface damage. But what if the craftsmen never soldered the face from the front? What if they attached it from behind, applying pressure and heat so carefully that the visible surface never cracked? What if the ears weren't drilled and filled later, but plugged using gold rods drawn from the same alloy, hammered until the atoms aligned seamlessly with the surrounding metal? X-rays would see nothing wrong. That possibility made the earlier conclusions far less comforting. The absence of evidence wasn't proof of authenticity. It was proof that the tools being used weren't designed for deception at that level. To uncover something that subtle, scientists needed a way to read not the shape of the metal, but its history. That's where quantum imaging came in. Unlike traditional scans, quantum resonance imaging doesn't rely on density or surface reflection. It measures how atoms respond to energy at the smallest possible scale. It detects variations in atomic vibration, displacement, and thermal stress, patterns left behind when metal is worked, reheated, or reshaped. In simple terms, it reads what the metal remembers. By the early 2020s, this technology was still experimental, mostly confined to physics institutes and classified research facilities. It wasn't designed for archaeology. It was built to test materials under extreme conditions, which is exactly why it was perfect. When a small group of physicists proposed scanning ancient gold artifacts to test the limits of their equipment, they weren't chasing headlines. They wanted to see whether the machines could distinguish between gold poured once and gold that had been reworked multiple times. King Tut's mask was never meant to be the star of that experiment. Officially, the scan request was submitted as a calibration test. Non-invasive. After hours. No drilling. No sampling. Just data. Permission was granted quietly. No press releases. No announcements. Late one evening, after the museum closed, the mask was positioned beneath the scanner. It sat there, silent and unmoving, just as it had for centuries. The machine hummed. Data streamed across monitors. For hours, nothing unusual appeared. Everything matched the official story. Until the scanner focused on the cartouche, the oval frame containing Tutankhamun's royal name. That's when the room went quiet. Because beneath the visible hieroglyphs, the machine detected something that shouldn't exist. A pattern of atomic displacement, unlike anything else on the mask. Gold that had been hammered, scraped, and compressed in a way that didn't match its surroundings. It wasn't damage. It wasn't corrosion. It was deliberate erasure. Technicians recalibrated the system. Ran the scan again. Same result. They expanded the analysis. The anomaly was confined to the name itself. as if someone had attacked that exact spot with surgical precision. And then the scan moved to the ears. To X-rays, they were solid. To quantum imaging, they weren't. The machine revealed perfectly shaped cylindrical structures beneath the surface, plugs. Gold rods inserted with such precision that the surrounding atoms had been forced to realign seamlessly around them. The ears hadn't been pierced and left that way. They had been pierced, then erased. The implications were staggering. Someone hadn't just reused the mask. They had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide that fact, using techniques so advanced that they stayed invisible until technology caught up thousands of years later. And then the scan reached the face. Along the boundary where the face meets the headdress, the quantum imager detected what physicists call thermal ghosting, a faint molecular signature indicating that this exact outline had once been heated to a different temperature than the surrounding gold. The face hadn't been soldered visibly. It had been attached from behind. The seam was invisible, but the atoms remembered. At that moment, the mask stopped being an artifact. It became a document, one that had recorded its own alteration at the molecular level. And the most unsettling question of all finally had an answer. Yes, something had been erased. The only question left was whether it could be recovered. Once the quantum imaging revealed evidence of erasure, the atmosphere in the room changed completely. This was no longer a technical test. It was an unplanned confrontation with history itself, the kind scholars dream about and fear at the same time. Because finding proof of alteration is one thing. Recovering what was erased is another. The team knew they were standing on unstable ground. If the data held up, it wouldn't just revise one artifact. It would force a reevaluation of an entire chapter of Egyptian history. Careers, reputations, and national narratives were suddenly at stake. But the science didn't care about reputations. Quantum resonance imaging doesn't just detect where metal has been worked differently. It can map the direction and intensity of those alterations. Every hammer strike, every scrape, every reheating leaves behind microscopic distortions. Alone, they look like noise. Together, they form a pattern, and patterns can be reconstructed. The idea was both simple and terrifying. If the erased hieroglyphs had been hammered flat instead of removed, traces of their original shapes might still exist beneath the surface, compressed, distorted, but not destroyed. So the team fed the data into a reconstruction model. There was no dramatic countdown, no guarantees. The process could have produced nothing but static. Instead, something began to take shape. Slowly, fragment by fragment. At first, it was just uneven pressure zones, then faint curves, then lines that didn't align with Tutankhamun's known cartouche. The computer wasn't guessing. It was following the physics, reversing the damage mathematically, layer by layer. The room stayed silent. Minutes passed. Then more. The screen filled with shapes that hadn't been seen in over 3,000 years. Hieroglyphic forms emerged, not clearly at first, but unmistakably. These weren't random marks. They followed royal structure, royal grammar, and then it became obvious. The name wasn't Tutankhamun, not even close. As the final characters resolved, there was no room left for interpretation. The reconstructed cartouche spelled a name long whispered, long feared, and officially missing from the burial record. Nefertiti. More specifically, the throne name historians believe she used when she ruled as pharaoh. A name deliberately erased from monuments. A name associated with a woman who stepped into absolute power and then vanished. This wasn't speculation anymore. The mask had spoken for itself. The implications hit all at once. If Nefertiti's name was beneath Tut's, then the mask had never been his. It was taken, altered, reassigned, and the effort required to do that wasn't symbolic. It was extreme. Plugging ear holes, reworking inscriptions, attaching a new face from behind, all to preserve appearances. That level of precision only makes sense under one condition: desperation. The priests weren't trying to deceive future historians. They were racing a sacred deadline. 70 days. No mask meant spiritual disaster. And somewhere nearby, a perfectly prepared royal mask already existed. One belonging to a ruler whose memory had become politically inconvenient. So they did the unthinkable. They stole a pharaoh's face. Not metaphorically. Literally. They removed it, replaced it, and buried a king wearing another ruler's identity. Then they erased the evidence as thoroughly as their tools allowed. For over 3,000 years, it worked, until a machine designed to read atomic memory undid the deception. But this revelation didn't settle the mystery. It detonated it. Because if the mask was altered this carefully, it raised an even darker question. This wasn't an isolated act. It was part of a system, a cover-up carried out at the highest levels of power. And that meant the mask wasn't the only thing that had been reused. It meant Tut's entire burial might be a patchwork of stolen objects, pulled together in panic and sealed with religious authority. And it meant Nefertiti's real burial equipment, her true mask, her true resting place, was still missing. Which leads to the most unsettling possibility of all. If her mask was stolen for Tut, what was placed on her face when she was buried? Or worse, was she ever buried properly at all? The mask, once a symbol of certainty, had become a question mark made of gold. And the more scientists verified the data, the clearer it became that this discovery wasn't going away. It had simply been waiting for technology advanced enough to listen. Discoveries like this don't change history overnight. They stall. They sit in quiet rooms, passed between specialists who understand exactly what confirming it would mean. Because this isn't just about a mask. It's about admitting that one of the most famous objects on Earth has been misunderstood for over a century. Officially, the findings are still being reviewed, verified, cross-checked. That sounds routine, but in reality, it's hesitation. Careers, institutions, and national narratives are built around the idea that the mask is Tut's. Changing that story wouldn't just rewrite a chapter. It would force a reckoning with how much of the burial was improvised. And the mask suggests it wasn't alone. Tut's tomb already shows signs of urgency. Reused artifacts, altered statues, rushed construction. The mask now confirms that the substitutions went all the way to the highest level. This wasn't a mistake. It was a coordinated solution to a crisis. The priests had 70 days. No mask meant spiritual failure. Somewhere nearby, a fully prepared royal mask already existed, belonging to a ruler whose memory had become inconvenient. So they altered it, plugged the ears, reworked the name, attached a new face from behind, then sealed the truth beneath gold and authority. That solution worked for 3,000 years, which raises the most unsettling questions of all. If Nefertiti's mask was taken, what happened to her real burial? Was she ever laid to rest properly? Or was her identity dismantled piece by piece? First politically, then physically? And if Egypt's most studied artifact could hide a deception this precise, how many others are sitting in museums right now, mislabeled, misattributed, carrying erased names no one thinks to question? The mask doesn't just change one story. It exposes a method, a way history can be overwritten so cleanly that only atomic memory can undo it. And that leaves us with a final realization. History doesn't always disappear. Sometimes it survives by hiding, waiting for the moment we finally learn how to see it. If a single object can hide a secret like this for thousands of years, imagine how many others are still out there, misidentified, misunderstood, or hiding something just beneath the surface. Subscribe now, because history isn't finished talking. We're just finally learning how to listen.